My name is Lara Wagner. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the person people describe as capable. Not impressive, not dramatic, just capable. The one who figures things out quietly, handles what needs handling, and doesn't ask to be noticed for it. I work in financial operations. My days are spent inside systems most people never think about: accounts, transfers, authorizations, timelines. The kinds of things that only matter when something goes wrong. And maybe because of that, people often assume I'm unaffected by emotion, that I'm practical to the point of being untouched. Even in my own family, I was seen as the steady one, the reliable sister, the one who didn't need watching. I was underestimated not because I was weak, but because I was calm. This story is about my brother, about how he drained my accounts and disappeared. But more importantly, it's about what I learned before and after that moment. Because the real turning point wasn't the money vanishing. It was the realization that I had misunderstood who he was, and perhaps who I had been trained to be. I want to be clear about something up front. This isn't a story about rage, revenge, or dramatic justice. There's no shouting match, no triumphant exposure, no moment where everyone claps because the truth finally comes out. What happened unfolded quietly, methodically, almost politely, and that's what made it so hard to see while it was happening. For a long time, I believed that staying silent was the same as being strong, that absorbing inconvenience, smoothing conflict, and not making things awkward was a form of maturity. I believed that trust, especially family trust, didn't need constant verification. You just gave it, and that was proof of love. I was wrong. Over the course of this story, I'll talk about how small permissions became large vulnerabilities, how patterns that didn't look dangerous on their own formed something much darker when viewed together, and how the moment I learned my brother's dark side wasn't explosive or emotional, but deeply clarifying. I'll also talk about restraint, about the choice not to confront immediately. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. Silence in this story isn't absence. It's presence without announcement. If you're expecting a villain and a hero, you won't quite find them here. What you'll find instead is a slow shift, from trust to awareness, from familiarity to precision. You'll see how someone who was never seen as a threat learned the power of being underestimated, and what it costs to finally stop playing the role you were assigned. I'm telling this story honestly, not to settle scores, and not to ask for sympathy, but because there are people listening right now who are quietly carrying more than anyone realizes. People who think patience is protection. People who believe that being the reliable one means they are safe from being used. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever been so trusted to handle everything that no one noticed when someone crossed a line with you? For most of my life, I existed in my family as a function, not a person. I don't say that with bitterness. It took me years to even find the language for it. At the time, it just felt normal. Families settle into roles the way water settles into grooves, quietly, without discussion. And once those grooves exist, no one questions why things flow the way they do. I was the responsible one, the one who remembered deadlines, fixed paperwork, and handled logistics. If something needed to be organized, explained, or quietly corrected, it found its way to me. I didn't resist that role. In fact, I leaned into it. Being useful felt like being valued. Being reliable felt like being loved. My brother, on the other hand, was seen as complicated, charismatic, a little reckless, maybe misunderstood. He was the one people worried about, defended, and made excuses for. When he struggled, it became a family conversation. When I handled something without complaint, it barely registered. That contrast shaped everything. At family gatherings, people would ask him how he was doing, really doing. With me, the question was always practical. Can you help with this? Do you know how to fix that? Can you explain this form? I became the person others leaned on without ever checking whether I was leaning back. And I told myself I preferred it that way. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. No one ignored me outright. I was respected, even praised, but in a narrow, utilitarian way. I was the smart one, the organized one, the calm one. Labels that sound flattering until you realize they leave no room for vulnerability. Calm people aren't supposed to need help. Organized people aren't supposed to fall apart. So I learned not to. When my brother asked for help, financial help, logistical help, help just for a little while, it felt natural to say yes. I understood systems. I knew how to make things work. And more importantly, I had been trained to believe that stepping in was my role. No one sat me down and told me to sacrifice. It was subtler than that. It was the quiet assumption that I could handle it, that I always would. If I hesitated, someone would say, "You're better at this than anyone." If I raised a concern, it was smoothed over with, "He's family." And because nothing terrible happened immediately, each concession felt harmless, temporary, reasonable. Looking back, I see how carefully my position was defined. I was trusted, but not protected. Included, but not prioritized. Needed, but not guarded. And I accepted that because it fit the story I had about myself. I was the steady one, the anchor, the adult in the room. Adults don't complain, they adjust. What's strange is that I didn't feel resentful during that time. I felt competent, useful, slightly tired maybe, but proud of my endurance. I told myself that being low maintenance was a strength, that not needing reassurance meant I was emotionally mature. I didn't notice that no one was watching my boundaries, because I wasn't watching them either. My brother knew this version of me well. He knew I wouldn't make a scene. He knew I wouldn't embarrass him. He knew I valued harmony more than recognition. And he knew, instinctively, that I would clean up messes before asking who made them. That knowledge didn't appear overnight. It accumulated in the same way my role did. Slowly, reliably. To everyone else, I was the safe one, the dependable one. The person thinks would never really go wrong. And because they believe that, no one questioned why I was always the one absorbing risk. Not them, not him, not even me. At least not yet. The first time something felt wrong, it was small enough that I almost dismissed it out of habit. It didn't involve a dramatic request or a sudden crisis. It was a casual assumption. One of those moments that slips past you because it arrives dressed as normal. My brother mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he needed temporary access to one of my accounts. Not ownership, just visibility. He framed it as convenience, a way to move faster while he got back on his feet. I remember the exact phrasing because it was careful. He didn't ask directly. He said, "It would just make things easier if I could see what's coming in and out." Easier for whom wasn't specified. And I filled in the answer without realizing it was a choice. At the time, it felt reasonable. I understood permissions. I knew the difference between access and control. And I trusted my own competence to monitor anything unusual. More than that, I trusted the history we shared. We'd grown up in the same house, shared the same routines, the same jokes, the same unspoken rules about family loyalty. So I said yes. Nothing bad happened immediately. That was the most convincing part. The account behaved normally. Bills were paid. No alerts. No overdrafts. Life continued exactly as before, which made the moment feel forgettable. If I thought about it at all, I framed it as generosity. Another quiet thing I handled without fuss. But something subtle shifted inside me. Not fear, not suspicion, awareness. I started noticing how often he referenced my finances in conversation. Casual comments. "You're fine this month, right?" Or, "That payment went through already." He never sounded worried, more like informed. And each time there was a tiny pause where I recalibrated, reminding myself that I had given him visibility. That this was normal now. I didn't mention it to anyone else. There was nothing concrete to report. No loss, no damage, just a feeling that the perimeter had moved and I hadn't marked where it used to be. What stood out wasn't what he did. It was how everyone else responded when money came up. If I expressed even mild caution, someone would say, "Lyra knows what she's doing." The statement was meant as reassurance, but it functioned as dismissal. My competence was used to override my discomfort, so I learned to stay quiet again. The first small cut isn't painful. That's why it works. It doesn't bleed enough to alarm anyone. It just teaches the body a new boundary, slightly closer to the center. Looking back, I can see how precisely calibrated that moment was. He didn't take. He tested. He watched how easily I adjusted, how quickly I normalized the change. He learned that I wouldn't dramatize a concern, that I would internalize it instead. And I told myself all the right things. That I was overthinking. That trust was a choice. That family doesn't require constant audits. I framed my silence as maturity, not avoidance. Everyone else forgot that moment entirely. For them, nothing had happened. For me, something had shifted, but I hadn't yet learned how to name it. Not yet. After that first small cut, nothing exploded. There was no immediate consequence, no clear line crossed that demanded a response. Instead, the new normal settled in quietly, the way fog does, thin at first, barely noticeable, until you realize the landscape has changed. My brother's access became an assumption rather than an exception. He spoke about my finances as if they were a shared resource, using we where there had once been you. "We'll be fine this month. We can move that around later." The language was subtle, but it mattered. Ownership was dissolving in conversation long before it disappeared in reality. I noticed it. I always noticed it. But noticing isn't the same as acting, especially when the cost of acting feels higher than the cost of enduring. Each time I considered pushing back, I ran through the same internal checklist. Was there proof? Had he technically done anything wrong? Would bringing it up create unnecessary tension? And the answer was always the same. Nothing concrete. Not yet. So I stayed quiet, telling myself I was being rational. Around us, the family dynamic reinforced that choice. My brother was still framed as the one who needed understanding. If he was stressed, people adjusted around him. If I was uncomfortable, it was invisible, because I didn't make it visible. When he made decisions that affected me without asking, they were described as practical, efficient. If I hesitated, someone would remind me that I was better with money anyway, as if that made my consent automatic. My skill set had become an open door. Disrespect, when it's normalized, rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as familiarity, as efficiency, as trust. And because I had been trained to value harmony, I translated each overstep into something more palatable. "He's just stressed. He didn't mean it that way. It's temporary." I even adjusted my own behavior to accommodate the discomfort. I checked accounts more often, but quietly. I documented things, but privately. I reassured others that everything was fine, even when I wasn't entirely sure it was. That's the dangerous part of rationalization. It feels intelligent. It feels calm. It allows you to believe you're in control while slowly surrendering it. What I didn't realize at the time was that my silence was teaching him something. Each unchallenged assumption became data. Each swallowed objection became confirmation. He learned that he could move a little faster each time, cross a little further, without resistance. And because nothing catastrophic happened, everyone, including me, interpreted that as proof that the system was working. I was still functioning, bills were still paid, life still looked stable from the outside. So the cost felt abstract, theoretical, something I could deal with later if necessary. But later has a way of arriving fully formed, without asking whether you're ready. By the time I recognized that the pattern wasn't accidental, that it was directional, I had already participated in making it possible. Not through weakness, but through patience. Through the belief that endurance was the same as strength. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand this. Disrespect doesn't escalate because it's loud. It escalates because it's tolerated. And I had been tolerating it expertly. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly realize I had been assigned a role. It became clear in retrospect, the way you only notice the shape of a room after you've been living in it for years. My role was never discussed out loud. No one announced it. But everyone behaved as if it had always been understood. I was the stabilizer. When something went wrong, eyes shifted toward me. Not with concern, but with expectation. If there was confusion, I was supposed to clarify it. If there was tension, I was supposed to smooth it out. If there was risk, I was supposed to absorb it quietly so no one else had to. That role came with compliments that doubled as constraints. You're so level-headed. You don't get emotional like the rest of us. You always land on your feet. Each one sounded like praise. Each one subtly removed my right to object. Because stabilizers aren't supposed to destabilize, I started to see how consistently this played out. Decisions that affected me were made without my input, then delivered as updates rather than questions. My brother would rearrange plans, move money, shift responsibilities, and the expectation was that I would adapt. Not because he asked, but because I always had. And when I did adapt, it confirmed the role. The system rewarded my compliance with smoothness and the absence of conflict. No one had to sit with discomfort as long as I handled it internally. What struck me wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Everyone benefited from my staying where I was. My brother benefited because he could move freely. The rest of the family benefited because they didn't have to choose sides or ask difficult questions. And I benefited in the shallow way people do when they are needed, through approval, through being told I was strong. But strength, I was learning, can be defined in ways that only serve others. I noticed how differently people responded when my brother struggled versus when I did. His problems were externalized. Mine were internalized. If he was overwhelmed, it was treated as a circumstance. If I was overwhelmed, it was treated as a miscalculation on my part. Something I would quietly correct. So I stopped signaling strain altogether. The role required emotional neutrality, reliability without friction, presence without demand. And I performed it well because I had been rehearsing it for years. It became clear that my brother understood this role better than anyone. He didn't need to pressure me. He didn't need to argue. He simply acted, knowing I would adjust around him. The system worked because I was its buffer. What unsettled me wasn't just that this role existed, but that I had accepted it without negotiation. I had mistaken being indispensable for being valued. I had been confused about being trusted and respected. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation felt like the wrong tool. The problem wasn't a single action or even a single person. It was a structure. And structures don't collapse when you raise your voice. They collapse when you stop holding them up. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. For the first time, I stopped asking how to fix things for everyone else and started observing what would happen if I didn't. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation that finally crossed a line. In fact, the day it happened was almost painfully ordinary. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, early morning light cutting across the surface in neat rectangles. Coffee cooling. Laptop open. I was reviewing transactions the way I always did, methodical, unhurried. This wasn't suspicion. It was routine. The kind of quiet maintenance no one notices until it stops. And then I saw it. A transfer that didn't fit the pattern. Not because it was large, not because it caused immediate damage, but because it had been routed in a way I would never choose. An unnecessary detour. A step was added for no practical reason. It was subtle enough that someone less familiar with systems would have ignored it completely. But I don't ignore patterns. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I was confused, but because I felt something rearrange internally. A calm click, like a lock engaging. This wasn't a mistake. That was the moment. Not panic, not anger, recognition. I pulled up older records. Slowly, carefully. No rush. And as I moved backward through time, the picture sharpened. Small deviations. Repeated behaviors. Each is defensible on its own. Together, unmistakable. What surprised me wasn't the discovery itself. It was my reaction to it. My heart rate didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. I felt steady, almost relieved. Because for the first time, the discomfort I'd been carrying had a shape. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time. I didn't call my brother. I didn't text anyone. I didn't confront the evidence. I let it sit, the way you let sediment settle before you judge the water. I needed to know whether this was an anomaly or a direction. That morning, I went about my day exactly as planned. Same meetings, same neutral tone, same helpful presence. Nothing about my behavior signaled that anything had changed, but internally, something had. I realized I had been asking the wrong question all along. I had been asking, is this bad enough to justify a response? What I should have been asking was, what does this reveal about intent? Intent doesn't announce itself loudly. It repeats. That day marked the end of something I hadn't known I was allowed to end. Automatic trust. Not trust as a concept. Trust as a reflex. From that point on, nothing moved without being understood first. I didn't feel betrayed yet. Betrayal implies loss. What I felt was clarity. And clarity has a way of stripping emotion down to something usable. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for accuracy. Before that day, my silence had been instinctive. A habit formed over years of smoothing things over, of choosing cohesion over friction without consciously weighing the cost. After that day, silence became something else entirely. It became deliberate. I didn't withdraw. I didn't change my tone. I didn't suddenly become distant or guarded in any visible way. From the outside, I was exactly the same Lyra I had always been. Calm, competent, available. That consistency wasn't accidental. It was camouflage. What changed was the way I listened. I stopped filling in gaps for other people. Stopped correcting assumptions out loud. When my brother spoke about money, about timelines, about plans that involved resources I technically controlled, I let him talk. I noted phrasing. I noted confidence. I noted how often he referenced outcomes rather than processes, as if the middle no longer mattered. Silence gave him room, and in that room he revealed far more than he would have under scrutiny. People often assume silence is weakness because they associate strength with assertion. But silence, when chosen, has weight. It removes the friction that forces others to be careful. It allows patterns to accelerate. And accelerated patterns are easier to see. I documented everything, but not obsessively. Dates, amounts, routes, language. I didn't need a mountain of evidence. I needed a clean line of logic. Something that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding or stress. At the same time, I paid attention to myself, to the old impulses, to rescue, to explain, to preempt discomfort. Each time I felt them rise, I let them pass. This wasn't punishment. It was a restraint. I noticed how quickly others mistook my calm for permission. My brother became more relaxed, more expansive. He talked about future plans with an ease that would have unsettled me before. Now, I simply observed. When he made assumptions, I didn't correct them. When he moved quickly, I let him. The irony is that nothing about my silence was passive. It required effort. It required resisting the urge to intervene before things became too much. But I understood something new now. Intervention too early would only reset the pattern. It would teach him to hide better. I wasn't trying to catch him in a moment. I was trying to understand the structure of his behavior. And the more space I gave, the clearer that structure became. Silence wasn't my absence, it was my vantage point. By choosing not to speak, I stopped stabilizing the system. I stopped absorbing shock. And for the first time, the system began to reveal its own weaknesses. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I hadn't decided what I would do with what I was learning. But one thing was certain. I would never again confuse quiet with helpless. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something entirely different was taking shape underneath. No one noticed because no one was looking in my direction anymore. I was still performing my role, efficient, composed, dependable. From the outside, there was no reason to monitor me, and that invisibility gave me time. Time to learn, time to map, time to position myself without resistance. I didn't make sudden moves. I didn't freeze accounts or change access overnight. That would have been obvious. Instead, I studied how the system breathed, when money moved, who initiated it, and how quickly it was expected to resolve. I watched which steps were automated and which relied on human trust. Most people think preparation looks like action. It doesn't. It looks like patience. I went back through months of records, sometimes years, tracing behavior rather than amounts. The same routing preferences, the same timing windows. The same justifications are questioned casually. What emerged wasn't chaos, it was consistency. And consistency is intention, stretched over time. I educated myself quietly on where my knowledge had gaps. Not through dramatic consultations or alarmed questions, but through neutral inquiry. I reread policy language. I refreshed my understanding of authorization hierarchies. I confirmed what could be reversed and what couldn't, and under what conditions. At the same time, I began documenting my own actions with unusual precision. Every approval, every permission, every verbal agreement is followed by a private note. Not because I expected a courtroom, but because clarity demands a record. What no one noticed was that I stopped compensating. I didn't remind my brother about deadlines. I didn't preempt problems he could solve himself. When something was slightly inconvenient, I let it be inconvenient. Not as punishment, but as data. I needed to see how he behaved when friction existed. The answer was telling. He became more impatient, less careful. His language shifted from explanation to assumption. He acted as if outcomes were guaranteed, as if the system would always bend the way it had before, because it always had. The family noticed none of this. To them, everything still looked stable. If anything, my brother seemed more confident, more together. And I was still the quiet one in the background, making sure nothing visibly broke. What they never noticed was that I was no longer protecting the flow. I was observing it. I didn't feel clever or triumphant during this phase. I felt focused, almost clinical. Emotion complicates observation, and I had learned how dangerous unexamined emotion could be. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was letting it happen. And in doing so, I was learning exactly how far things could go. Without interference, without correction, without the safety net I had always provided. That knowledge would matter later. More than they could possibly imagine. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. By the time it fully surfaced, I had already felt its outline for weeks. What surprised me wasn't what I found, but how complete it was once I allowed myself to see it without softening the edges. I was alone when it came together. Late evening. The apartment was quiet in that way that makes your own thoughts sound louder. I had everything laid out, not physically, but mentally. Transactions, timing, language, behavior. Each piece had been observed separately. That night, I stopped separating them. I didn't rush. I recreated the sequence from the beginning, step by step, as if I were explaining it to someone who had no emotional investment at all. No brother, no family history, just actions and outcomes. Permissions granted, boundaries assumed, access widened, transfers routed, questions deflected. When viewed that way, the conclusion was unavoidable. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a strategy. Not sophisticated, not cinematic, but practiced. Rehearsed through small tests, adjusted through feedback. He had learned where I would hesitate, where I would rationalize, where I would stay silent to keep the peace. And he had built his behavior around that knowledge. What I felt in that moment wasn't heartbreak. It was a distance. The version of my brother I had been protecting, defending internally even when no one asked, collapsed under the weight of evidence. In his place was someone far more ordinary and far more dangerous. Someone who understood systems just well enough to exploit them, and people just well enough to believe he wouldn't be challenged. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to confront him immediately. Emotion came later, in quieter ways. What arrived first was clarity, and with it, an unexpected sense of control. Because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I also knew something else, just as important. He didn't think I knew. That asymmetry mattered. I reviewed what leverage existed, not as power, but as reality. What could be documented? What could be verified independently? What actions, once taken, would change the situation without requiring anyone else's permission or belief? There was no satisfaction in this process, no sense of victory, just a narrowing of options, a sharpening of focus. For the first time, I allowed myself to stop asking whether he would change if I spoke up. That question no longer mattered. The only question that remained was what I would do with the information now that I had it, knowing that whatever choice I made would be irreversible, not because of drama, but because of consequence. I closed my notebook that night without making a decision, but I knew I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. Some truths don't demand an audience. They demand action. Once something is fully seen, it can't be unseen. That's the quiet pressure that settles in after clarity. Not urgency, but inevitability. I gave myself time. Not to delay, but to choose without illusion. I laid out every option as plainly as I could, stripping emotion from the equation. I could confront my brother directly, demand explanations, force a confession or a denial. That path offered immediacy, but it also offered escape. Room for excuses, apologies, promises that would sound sincere enough to fracture my resolve. I could warn the family, ask for intervention, frame it as a concern rather than an accusation. That path would distribute responsibility, but it would also dilute truth. It would turn facts into opinions, patterns into perspectives. And I knew how quickly certainty dissolves when people are asked to choose between discomfort and denial. I could do nothing. Let the system continue as it was. Absorb the loss as a private consequence of misplaced trust. That path would preserve peace on the surface, but it would cost something deeper. It would confirm, permanently, the role I had been assigned. Then there was the option I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. I could act quietly, precisely, in ways that didn't require permission or belief, in ways that acknowledged reality without dramatizing it. That option came with a cost. Once taken, there would be no easy return to normal. No shared pretense, no comfortable ambiguity. It wouldn't destroy my brother publicly, but it would end his access permanently. And with it, the illusion he depended on. I sat with that weight longer than any of the others. I wasn't choosing punishment. I was choosing alignment between what I knew and how I behaved, between my values and my actions. Silence had carried me this far. Now, accuracy demanded movement. What finally settled it wasn't anger. It was a simple realization. Protecting myself did not require his understanding. I didn't owe him a warning that would only help him adapt. I didn't owe the family a version of events softened enough to be digestible. I owed myself coherence. So I chose the irreversible option, not dramatically, not all at once, but decisively. The moment the decision crystallized, something eased inside me. Not relief, resolve. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need reinforcement. I went to sleep that night knowing that when I woke up, nothing would look different to anyone else. But the direction of everything had already changed. The first thing I did was nothing visible. That was intentional. I didn't cut access abruptly. I didn't confront discrepancies. I didn't signal concern in my voice or my posture. From the outside, the system looked unchanged, and that illusion was important. Because movement attracts attention, and attention invites interference. What I began instead was a sequence of small, lawful adjustments, the kind that look like routine maintenance, if anyone ever bothers to notice them at all. I separated accounts, not dramatically, just functionally. I reclassified certain funds, shifted where income landed, and adjusted timing windows. None of it violated trust on paper. None of it required explanation. These were changes any careful person might make after reviewing their finances. And because I had always been careful, it raised no suspicion. I tightened permissions quietly, not revoking access outright, but narrowing it. Read only became delayed. Delayed became partial. Partial became irrelevant. Each step was justified individually. Together, they changed the landscape. I documented everything as I went, not for leverage, but for continuity. I wanted a clean record of intent on my side. Calm, consistent, proportionate. At the same time, I stopped compensating socially. When my brother hinted at timing assumptions, that should clear by Friday. We'll move that later. I didn't correct him or reassure him. I let uncertainty exist, not as a threat, but as reality. The system was no longer bending automatically around his expectations. He noticed something, but not enough to understand it. That's the danger of gradual change. It's felt as inconvenience, not resistance. He grew slightly more impatient, asked indirect questions, tested boundaries with casual remarks. I responded neutrally, never lying, never revealing. Behind the scenes, I prepared for the moment when invisibility would end. I confirmed which actions were final once initiated, which safeguards are activated immediately, which channels bypassed internal negotiation altogether. I wasn't looking for escalation. I was ensuring that when the shift became apparent, it would already be complete. There was no rush. I wasn't reacting to him anymore. I was following a plan that existed independently of his behavior. That was new for me. What surprised me most was how little emotional energy it took. Once the decision had been made, everything else felt procedural, almost peaceful, as if my mind had been waiting for alignment all along. By the time the final adjustments were in place, nothing outward had changed, but the system no longer relied on my silence to function. And that meant the consequences, when they came, would emerge on their own. The consequences didn't arrive with a crash. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up as irritation in my brother's voice. Small comments that didn't quite land anywhere. That's taking longer than usual. The system must be lagging. He said them casually, as if to himself, as if the problem were temporary and external. I listened. I said nothing. The delays he was experiencing weren't dramatic. Nothing failed outright. But expectations stopped being met. Transfers didn't resolve when he assumed they would. Amounts weren't where he thought they'd be. The ease he had grown accustomed to, movement without resistance, was gone. What struck me was how quickly his confidence eroded once the system stopped adapting to him. He checked in more often, not directly, never with a clear question. Instead, he circled, asked about unrelated things, brought up future plans that depended on money being available. Each comment was a probe, looking for reassurance that things were still under his control. I didn't give it. From my side, everything was stable. Bills were paid, obligations met. There was no crisis to point to, no visible reason for concern, which meant that from the outside, his frustration had nowhere to attach. That's when others started to feel it. Family conversations shifted subtly. Someone mentioned that he seemed stressed again. Someone else suggested he might need support. The narrative was familiar. The difference was that this time there was nothing for me to fix. I stayed quiet. Without my buffering, his pressure had to go somewhere. And instead of being absorbed invisibly, it began to register as friction. Not dramatic enough to alarm anyone, but noticeable enough to unsettle them. He asked me finally if I'd noticed anything off. I told the truth. Calmly. I said things looked normal on my end. And they did. That answer unsettled him more than an accusation would have, because it removed the possibility of shared confusion. If things were normal for me, then whatever he was experiencing belonged to him alone. The system was no longer validating his assumptions. That's the moment consequences truly begin, not when loss occurs, but when entitlement encounters reality and finds no one rushing to cushion the impact. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance, the kind that forms when you stop participating in a dynamic that only worked because you carried more than your share. Nothing irreversible had surfaced yet, but the direction was clear. And for the first time, he was the one adjusting to uncertainty, without understanding why. By the time the panic surfaced, the window to fix anything had already closed. It didn't announce itself loudly. Panic rarely does at first. It crept in as urgency disguised as concern. My brother reached out more directly now, not accusatory, not confrontational, but unsettled. He asked questions that circled the same point from different angles, as if the right phrasing might restore what had already shifted. Did anything change? Are you sure everything's the same as before? Maybe we should review things together. That last one stood out. Reviewing things together had always meant I would explain, adjust, and reassure. It was an invitation back into the old structure, a chance for him to recalibrate once he realized the system no longer moved automatically in his favor. I declined, politely, without justification. Not because I wanted him to panic, but because an explanation would have been a gift. It would have told him where the boundaries now were. And boundaries only work when they don't need to be explained. His tone shifted after that. The calm veneer cracked just enough to reveal urgency underneath. He mentioned obligations, pressures, timelines, not as requests, but as facts, as if stating them would make them my responsibility again. I listened. I didn't intervene. Around him, things started unraveling quietly. Plans stalled. Assumptions failed. The confidence he once moved with gave way to agitation, and because nothing visible had gone wrong, there was no clear target for his frustration. That's when regret appeared, not as accountability, but as nostalgia. He spoke about how things used to work, how smooth everything had been, how reliable I was. Each comment framed stability as something that had been taken from him, rather than something he had exhausted. It was too late to repair the dynamic because repair would have required honesty long before fear entered the conversation. Now, any attempt to fix things was driven by loss, not understanding. I felt something then, not triumph, not vindication, but finality. There is a moment when someone realizes that the door they assumed was always open has closed. Not slammed, not locked with ceremony, just closed. And the realization doesn't come with noise. It comes with disbelief. He tried one last time to restore normalcy through familiarity. A casual message, an inside reference, a reminder of shared history. It might have worked once. It didn't know, because by then, the truth was no longer something I carried alone. It was embedded in the structure itself. And structures once changed, don't argue back. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like what most people imagine. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no list of accusations delivered with shaking hands. It happened quietly, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, because by then it didn't need its own stage. My brother asked to meet. Not urgently, just a message suggesting coffee, framed as catching up. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because avoidance would have added weight to a moment that didn't deserve it. We sat across from each other in a neutral place, public enough to discourage theatrics, familiar enough to feel safe. He looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. His confidence, once effortless, now required effort to maintain. He spoke first, carefully. He talked around the issue for a while. Work stress, timing problems, things not lining up. He waited for me to fill in the gaps. I didn't. Eventually, he said my name and stopped. That pause carried more than any accusation could have. I told him, calmly, that I was aware of what had been happening. Not everything. Not every detail. Just enough. I didn't show him the documents. I didn't list dates. I didn't need to. I said I had changed how I handled my finances, and that the changes were permanent. That was it. He reacted the way people do when they realize the conversation isn't a negotiation. First confusion, then disbelief, then a brief attempt to reframe. Stress, misunderstanding, timing, familiar defenses, delivered softly. I didn't argue with any of it. I told him I wasn't there to debate intent. I wasn't asking for explanations. I was informing him of a boundary that already existed. Whether he agreed with it or not, it no longer mattered. The absence of anger unsettled him more than anger ever could have. There was nothing to push against, no emotion to redirect, just a statement of fact. He asked if this meant we were done. I said no, not dramatically. I said it meant things were different now. Difference, I had learned, doesn't require hostility. We finished our coffee, talked briefly about neutral things, the weather, traffic, ordinary closure. When we stood to leave, there was no resolution, because resolution implies repair. This wasn't repaired. It was an acknowledgement. I walked away without feeling heavier or lighter, just intact. For the first time, I wasn't carrying both sides of the relationship by myself, and that was enough. What changed afterward wasn't loud or visible. There was no dramatic transformation, no reinvention announced to the world. From the outside, my life looks much the same. I still work quietly. I still keep my routines. I still move through the world without demanding attention. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. Before all of this, I thought strength meant endurance, absorbing strain without complaint, staying steady no matter how much weight was added. I thought dignity lived in patience, in not making things uncomfortable for other people. Now I understand that dignity also lives in limits. I am still reliable, still thoughtful, still capable. But those traits are no longer open access. They are choices, offered intentionally rather than assumed automatically. My relationship with my brother exists in a different register now. Cordial, bounded, realistic. There is no ongoing conflict, and no illusion of closeness that can be exploited. We speak when necessary. We don't revisit the past. What mattered was never the argument. It was the recalibration. More importantly, my relationship with myself has changed. I pay attention when something feels off, even if I can't immediately justify it with evidence. I don't rush to neutralize discomfort, just to restore harmony. And I no longer outsource my sense of safety to shared history or good intentions. Being underestimated no longer feels like a disadvantage. It's a form of freedom. People still see me as calm, as composed, as the one who has things handled. The difference is that now I know exactly what I'm handling and for whom. There is no bitterness in this version of me, no hunger to prove anything. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control over others. It's about alignment within yourself. When your actions match your understanding, there's nothing left to defend. I didn't lose my family. I didn't lose my values. I lost a role that no longer fit, and in doing so, I gained clarity. And clarity is sustainable. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a lesson that feels sharp and satisfying. A rule you can repeat. A warning you can deliver with certainty. But the truth I walked away with isn't dramatic enough for that. It's quieter. And because it's quiet, it lasts. What happened between my brother and me wasn't just about money. The money was a vehicle, not the destination. The real issue was access. Who had it, who assumed it, and who was never taught to protect it. For a long time, I believed that being good meant being available. That loyalty meant flexibility. That love meant not keeping score. Those beliefs aren't wrong on their own. But when they're one-sided, they become vulnerabilities disguised as virtues. No one wakes up intending to cross a line all at once. Lines are crossed when they're not clearly drawn. When silence is mistaken for consent. When reliability is mistaken for permission. The hardest part of this experience wasn't the loss. It was accepted that clarity doesn't always come with apology or understanding. Sometimes, the most honest outcome is simply separation from a role that was slowly erasing you. I didn't punish my brother. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't expose him to anyone who didn't need to know. What I did was stop participating in a dynamic that only worked because I carried more than my share of the weight. And that was enough to change everything. If there's a takeaway here, it's this. Quiet people are not empty people. Calm does not mean unguarded. And being the one who can handle it doesn't mean you should have to, especially alone. Boundaries don't require anger to be valid. They don't require permission. And they don't require explanation to the people who benefited from their absence. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in parts of it, the reliable one, the steady one, the person everyone leans on, this isn't a call to harden yourself or withdraw from the world. It's an invitation to notice. To notice when trust becomes assumption, when generosity becomes expectation, when your silence is doing work you never agreed to do. I didn't become louder after this. I became clearer. And that clarity changed the direction of my life without burning it down. Before I end, I want to ask you something. No right answer, no judgment, just reflection. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped fixing everything was the moment things finally became honest?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.